with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show.
Okay, everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. Thank you so much for checking in wherever you are in the world today. I have Dr. Megan Reitz, and she is an associate fellow at the Side Business School, Oxford University, and adjunct professor of leadership and dialogue at Hult International Business School. She focuses on how we can create the conditions for transformative dialogue at work, and her research is at the intersection of leadership, change, dialogue, and mindfulness. She is on the Thinkers50 ranking of global business thinkers and is ranked in HR Magazine's most influential thinkers listing. Megan has written Dialogue in Organizations and Mind Time, and she has published Speak Out, Listen Up, which is the second edition of her best-selling book, Speak Up, with Financial Times Publishing. Speak Up was shortlisted for the CMI Management Book of the Year in 2020. Megan's also a contributor to the Harvard Business Review, MIT Sloan Management Review. She has presented her research on the BBC, CNBC, and she writes for numerous academic and practice-based journals. Her research on employee activism was nominated for the Thinkers50 Breakthrough Idea Award in 2021, and her TED Talk on the topic has been viewed more than 1.5 million times. I watched that today. Good work. Her latest research focuses on spaciousness, how whilst attending to the task, we can also create, hold, and value the space to innovate, reflect, learn, and develop relationships in workplaces that are increasingly experienced as instrumental and addicted to busyness. She is the mother of 2 wonderful teenage daughters who test her regularly on her powers of mindfulness and dialogue. It sounds like a laboratory, a simulation, a 24-hour, 365, 18-year simulation you've entered.
And I didn't sign up for it, Scott. Nobody told me. Nobody told me at the beginning.
I'm in a similar simulation, but it's just all about emotional intelligence.
I gave up on that a while back.
Examples of her work and her details can all be found in the show notes. Megan, I am so excited to have a conversation with you. And I want to start in maybe a place that you even aren't expecting. As I read the TED Talk statistic right there, 1.5 million views, just congratulations. That's wonderful. But you had me at your website, and you are, in my mind, what we need as academics. And I'm being very, very biased, and that's going to kind of frustrate some people when I say that. But I have this newsletter, I have this podcast, and there's just incredible work that academics are doing, and all of it is behind a paywall. And I can't find people in this newsletter that I want to put out every week. And listeners, you can find a link in the show notes. Very few academics are active in blogging and posting their work in places that are accessible where the general public can find it. And what that does is it creates this vacuum, and it creates a space for places like Bain or Gallup or McKinsey, all valuable in their own right, but they're kind of commanding the space when it comes to setting the narrative around how business people learn. And so I love the fact that I can go to your website, there's some blog posts, there's some resources, there's a lot there that I can grab. The TED Talk, again, the work is getting out there to the public. So I would just love to start there a little bit, because I think for some listeners, especially some of the academics, it's not necessarily a comfortable, normal space for us. It's not the thing to kind of be out there on LinkedIn or the thing to be putting ourselves out there into the media. But I think it's critical. I think it's so important. And I love that you're doing that.
Thank you. I'm not the world's best on social media by any stretch of the imagination. I can just about manage to be okay on LinkedIn, but I do use it, and I will be using it quite purposefully. I think the reason why I'm drawn to TED, I'm drawn to blogs, is because my method of choice, I suppose, for years and years has been action research and specifically cooperative inquiry.
Yeah.
So I explore phenomena, but in inquiry and in dialogue with others as co-researchers and co-participants. And so therefore, of course, what I quite like doing is putting stuff out in the world that is not neat and not finished. And it's not at a stage of like, here's the answer. It's always like, here's something I'm thinking about and something that's just happened to me. Let me put it up there and let me find out what you all think about that, because that's my method. You know, my method is in inquiry with others. And so if it sits behind a paywall where I don't get to see people's reactions to it, then I'm the poorer for it. So it links, I think, very much to the method that I tend to use.
Well, and of course, that method then also has you embedded, that might be the wrong phrasing, but you're engaging with people doing the work consistently, right? And we're not sitting in a building writing another paper about the big 5 personality traits. We are actually interacting with individuals doing the work. And I think that's another thing that at times my personal biases were at times a little too far from it. Does that make sense? Do you agree, disagree? How do you think about that?
I am obsessed with impact, with seeing people experiment with ideas and learn with me, preferably there with my researcher hat on, and experimentation, learning, developing new things and trying again. And that is my research as well. So, it's all sort of mixed in together, but it's vital for me that I allow people to think differently and point out things that they may not have looked at previously, but then want to experience and experiment with, and particularly in the workplace. So how do we create workplaces that enable us to flourish? And, we do some absurd stuff in the workplace, such as meetings. Most meetings are absurd. So I want to be out there with people, creating spaces where we can just pause and say, why are we doing this? What are the habits that we've got stuck in? And what might we reflect on that would enable us to experiment and then move forwards and change things so that we have workplaces where we can be a little bit more human?
Yes. And workplaces that the individual, the human being feels, gosh, you had this beautiful phrase. One thing I've loved about this podcast is that at times people will make certain comments or they'll have certain phrasings that just have stuck with me. And as I was doing some research for our conversation, you were being interviewed by a media outlet and you made a comment. You said, a question I like to ask individuals, well, what happens when you speak up around here? What happens, right? And it's just such a beautiful question because it's tragic when we have these environments where people don't feel like they can speak up. And of course, you can talk in a couple moments to like, what are some of the ramifications when people don't feel like they can? But we're kind of bumping up against some of that psychological safety literature, and we're bumping up against a number of different topics. But even when we have these environments where people don't feel that they can speak up, the waste, the drama, it's absolutely mind-boggling, and it's tragic in a lot of ways. So your mission of how do we create healthier workplaces, I think it's very, very admirable. What happens when people speak up around here? What are the answers you get to that question? I'm fascinated.
I have to say, probably a lot of negative answers. generally. It's an interesting one. It started 10 years ago, pretty much. I started my research with John Higgins and on a project called Speaking Truth to Power. And at the time, with the first organization that I was inside inquiring with, and I tell this story a lot, a leader had sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, Megan, we've got a bit of a problem. All of these people over here, all these employees, the junior employees, they're not speaking up, and we need them. We need their ideas. We need them to tell us when they've messed up, because we don't want to be on the front page of the newspaper. VW emissions scandal had just happened and rocked a lot of major organizations. And they said, so Megan, they're not speaking up. Can you go and, make them speak up?
Yes.
And so I went with my research hat on. I went over to speak to these employees, and it's a true story that really the first thing I said, so what happens when you speak up around here? They said, last time somebody spoke up around here, they disappeared.
And did they lean in and say it really quietly like that?
And I was like, yeah, right. In what way did they disappear? And there is, it was a true story. Somebody had, challenged the chief executive in a town hall meeting. And actually, this had happened quite a long time ago, but the story was just so good that it was reverberating. It probably still is reverberating in the same organization. And, sure thing, the following week, this employee was no longer there. Of course, nobody actually knew whether the employee had already resigned and was leaving and therefore said what they wanted in the meeting because they were going. Nobody had checked out the story. And I think that's quite important, actually. The nuance gets completely lost in these things.
Yes. Yeah, the narrative bias, we just fill in the blanks and create the story.
Absolutely. So, what happens when you speak up around here? It depends. But a lot of people fear speaking up for some, mainly people fear being perceived negatively, or they fear upsetting or embarrassing the other person. And they associate speaking up with conflict, and they associate conflict with meaning that they won't be liked and they won't be in relationship. And that's a dangerous place to be in the workplace. But I think actually another response to that question, which people often mean but don't say straight away, is, well, what happens when you speak up around here? It depends on your status and authority. It depends on the way we perceive power in this particular system. And if you're perceived as powerful and as having status and authority and the titles and labels that go with that, then your experience can be obviously very different to if you don't have those labels. And that's really meant that John and I, over the last 10 years, have particularly explored, I suppose you could say, power is the architecture of our conversations at work.
Yeah.
And therefore, if an organization needs to change what I call their conversational habits, so in other words, if they need people to say different sorts of things and they need to listen to different sorts of voices, then they've got to examine the way that they construct power, status, and authority. And they've got to talk about it. But beautifully, ironically, power is the last thing that most people want to talk about because it's all a bit awkward.
Well, Megan, I was in an organization, this might have been 4 months ago, and the founder was in the room. And he kind of stood up and he said, anyone in here can talk to me anytime they want to. I have an open door and people have come and talked to me. And I can just see the nonverbals of the room. No, we can't. We can't. Save us. But it's so interesting, too, because I think in his mind, he believed that. And even as he's saying that, no one's willing to say.
Isn't it? It's wonderfully, wonderfully ironic. The moment when a leader leans forward and says, I mean, can you all speak to me? I mean, do you feel comfortable speaking
You're good,
to me?
Right? You're good. Yes, we are. Oh, yes. Oh, all the time. I talked to you that 2 times a couple of years ago.
There's a couple of things here that really came up in our research and that are relevant to that. One, really we all need to engage. Well, we need to engage with both of them. But the first one is something that we call superiority illusion. And that is the fact that most of us, all of us, pretty much think we're better at listening than we're perceived to be by others. This is a very, well-known phenomenon. We rate ourselves on our intent to listen. We rate other people on their behavior. And so there's a gap. And so already we're all thinking, well, I'm good at listening and I'm approachable. I'm really quite lovely, so there won't be an issue. And many leaders and managers I work with are lovely. They're lovely people, but they've got these titles and labels that, of course, mean that they're intimidating. And, the second concept, if you like, that we look at is called advantage blindness.
Yes.
And when we have some of the titles and labels that convey status and authority in a particular system, we very often don't notice them.
Yes.
Whereas in a system, when we have the lower status labels, it's really, really obvious.
It's there.
We can see it a mile away and we can see the impact. So your poor chief executive is sitting there. So in fact, our first article for Harvard Business Review was called "The Problem with Saying My Door is Always Open."
Yes.
We have well-meaning leaders that think, well, I'm pretty good at this. I'm good at listening. People have spoken to me before. Therefore, that proves the point. And they, well-intentioned, they give out these invitations. But of course, people don't want to upset them. If you want somebody to be able to disagree with you, to point out a blind spot, and you're in a position of authority, you're going to have to try really hard to help them to disagree with you because they don't want to.
Yes. And it's amazing because also another little nuance of this conversation, I had an authority figure once. This was in school that I worked in. We were doing a retreat. There's very, very expensive retreat, one of these meetings where everyone's offline for a few days, expensive consultants, et cetera, et cetera. So we're talking tens of thousands of dollars. And we're probably no more than maybe 40 minutes into the conversation. And at one point, because, the norms were created over, this is a safe space for us to ideate and create and build and create, kind of explore. And I made a comment and this authority figure looked at me and said, well, if we're going to be negative for the next 2 days, we aren't going to get very far.
Oh,
and boom, like literally you could see that the thing was done in the minds of participants. I gently pushed back. I said, I apologize if that came off as negative. It's not meant to be negative. I just really hope we push new boundaries and get somewhere really, really cool because I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And then there was kind of like a gruff comment after that. And so it was amazing. Everyone remembered that. Everyone witnessed that. No one else put themselves out there. And the retreat was basically then just kind of this person's agenda railroaded forward. And ultimately, what then was invested in hundreds of thousands of dollars failed. And it's amazing because leaders also have to be so skilled at, even if you do open that door of, I want that feedback, let's have dialogue, they have to be so skilled at actually living into that because the memories are long and it'll shut people down. And again, to your point, that fear and some of that anxiety and all of that kind of takes over. And it's tragic when it comes to decision-making in organizational life.
By the time this podcast comes out, this might have been published. I have an article coming out again in HBR with Amy Edmondson, who obviously is very well known for her work with psychological safety. And we look at exactly these sorts of what I might call conversational failures.
Yes.
That people around can spot, but there's never a pause to kind of mend them or examine them or realize the implications of them.
Yes.
And, a lot of Amy's work is in intelligent failures.
Yes.
With this idea of, if we're changing habits, if we're looking to be even better, if you like, at dialogue, then just like anything else that we're trying to learn that we don't know yet, we're going to mess up.
Yes.
We're going to speak up. It's going to come out wrong, primarily because we're probably nervous as well. And leaders will have the right intent, but they're going to send signals
Yes.
that they're completely oblivious to. They don't even realize that they've just shut everybody down.
Totally oblivious. This person was totally oblivious. Yeah.
This is the article that we've just written. How can we see these failures as failures that are to be expected and then learnt from so that we improve? As opposed to, what I see all the time is a leadership team, doing a kind of psychological safety initiative, if you like, and right, let's make it safe to speak up. And then there's this sort of underlying assumption that, right, now everybody's going to do this really expertly. But of course they're not. So then we need the spaces where we're able to identify things like that and learn from them. That leader needs the capacity for somebody to say, that moment, you may not have even realized, but the way you responded shut down. Now, what could we do next time? And when you don't see that learning happening, it's a double whammy. I've got head in my hands even more because there's no possibility of furthering and deepening that.
Well, yes. Again, back to kind of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for here is, but the irony then is that even in those moments when that individual is messing up, they still are shutting themselves off from that feedback. They aren't aware of it and they continue it. And so it's so fascinating. It's just subtle. It can be nonverbal cues, like, come on, let's hurry up. This is, you're wasting my time right now. It could just be nonverbals. It can be verbal cues. But I love your phrasing there. I think Brené Brown calls it rumbling. How are we going to rumble? We're going to start this initiative. Do we have some norms? But we are going to make mistakes. But when we do make mistakes, are we going to elevate those mistakes so we can learn from them? And there's some pre-work that probably has to be done before just the obligatory phrase of, no idea is a bad one. Let's have a great conversation and go. And then all of a sudden, what happens is what I described earlier. We're going to mess up. We're not going to be perfect. There's going to be mistakes. And even when those mistakes are made, is the individual authority figure open to hearing that? And if they're not, we could go to kind of like complexity and complex adaptive problems that organizations are facing right now. And you see this, you have leaders really making decisions in a vacuum because everyone's sitting in the room and they disagree. No one's saying it. The leader thinks they're walking out with a unified front. They don't have it. The water cooler conversation happens afterwards. And again, time, energy, money, it's lost.
There's a sort of education process that I call it the optimism bubble. When you're in a role like a manager or a senior leader, we tend to be in this sort of optimism bubble. We've done a very extensive survey with about 22,000 now employees around the world on speaking up and listening up. And one thing's fairly clear is that as you get more senior, you are likely to think that people around you are speaking up more than they actually are.
Yes.
And you're likely to overestimate your listening skills and your approachability at the same time. So all this means that you're in this lovely optimism bubble where you think that you're hearing what you need to. So the very first point of the work that I do with leadership teams is to just burst the bubble.
Yes.
And just say, no, you're not. You so aren't hearing what you need to hear. Even if you think, no, we just had a very great conversation. No, you're still not hearing what you need to hear. And then, of course, then we go to, how can we ask? Because there is an irony. You can't just sort of say, give me some feedback. How do you get people essentially to disagree with you? How are you going to frame a question where people are able to do that? How do you look at whether, who are the people that you go to for opinions and advice? Are you in a kind of echo chamber? And how do you respond when people do disagree with you? That is the moment. That's the moment to be mindful, and that a lot of my other research is in mindful leadership. How can you notice and observe that in the moment and then choose your response? And of course, none of us are good at that all the time. We need a wingman or a wingwoman or two that are there to nudge us in the ribs and say, psst, you've forgotten, do that differently, ask that a different way. So we need to prepare to learn. We need to be able to spot things as they happen. And then we need to get better at learning all the time. And that's the other point in this article is, we need to learn to learn. How are we learning? What do we need to improve in order to get better at that?
Well, and so much then of this gets into how are we going to dialogue? And of course, that's another area of expertise that you bring to the table. How are we going to have these conversations, bring forth multiple perspectives? And again, when it's these complex adaptive challenges, we could call them a number of different things. But when there's no authority figure we can call in the world to say, hey, how do we reduce our turnover by 5%? Give me the 4 things. What's the recipe? That doesn't exist. It's a group of people co-creating their best guess as the next experiment or series of experiments that we run to see if we can move the needle. And that's going to require some dialogue. And so maybe I think we could prop up another conversation for the future, but are there some things that are just critical when it comes to, you've mentioned mindfulness. I imagine this is in there, but what are some of the critical elements of then engaging in the healthy dialogue to try and get to our best guess as to how to move forward?
I'm going to say one thing that isn't practical in the sense that I'm not going to kind of narrow down and go for something really pragmatic, because I want to just point out something that all of this is underpinned by. And essentially, that's kind of our ontological perspective on the world. The work that I'm doing now on spaciousness, it's really work in progress. And I would love to have another conversation with you about this. But we're looking at what we're calling at the moment the instrumental gaze in organizations. And that is this habit of seeing the world instrumentally. So this is inspired by the work of Ian McGilchrist and also Martin Buber. And there is a way of being in the world where we see ourselves as separate. We see utility. Our focus is narrow. It tends to be short-term, tangible, target-driven. Mm-hmm. And that is vital for survival, okay? And there is another way, of course, of engaging and encountering the world, let alone our workplace. And that is when we encounter the world as emergent, as systemic, as constant change, as interdependence, relational. And we make fundamentally different choices depending on the gaze that we have. So in terms of dialogue, again, we could, then debate what even we mean by that word.
Yes.
But in dialogue, I use Martin Buber's work and I talk about our capacity to turn towards the person. He uses that phrase, we turn, we attend fully to the other.
Yeah.
And we enable that other person's voice in doing that. Now, in order to do that and in order to get into the messier world of complexity, we need to see the world in that way. Otherwise, we immediately reduce and we get a conversation. We create a space where we have an away day. And guess what? Everybody just talks about operations and whether we're about to meet the quarterly target and what needs to be done.
Yes.
Important, but only in balance. So that's, the first thing I would say around dialogue. And we are obsessed with being busy, pathologically busy, I would say, in our workplaces. So that's never going to enable us to have dialogue. So I think that's really important. And the other thing I would say, which will probably resonate with your listeners, is, of course, we've had a framing of leadership, of leaders, I should say, rather. We've had a framing of leaders forever that pretty much, certainly in management and leadership development, that identifies the leader as the person that, knows the answer, that needs to charismatically communicate that to persuade everybody that they're right and they should be followed.
Yes.
And that's really how we've taught, I'm generalizing, of course I'm generalizing, but we taught leaders and managers to do that forever. By the way, sometimes that's still really important.
No, yes, yes. That's a great nuance. Yes, sometimes that is important, right?
Sometimes that needs to be done. Exactly. And sometimes we are engaging in subjects and topics that we don't understand, we don't know, we can't feasibly, there is no solution. And when that's the case, as a leader, your practice has to shift and you have to enable people to disagree with you. And goodness me, is that a different practice to the former? So both of those are fundamental to dialogue, really.
Yes. And am I ambidextrous in my ability to know when it is maybe more appropriate to try and inspire and influence my vision, and when it is more appropriate to slow down, pause, turn toward, engage, look forward? And, something else I'm seeing lately, and you're seeing this as well, I'm very, very confident. I don't have a name for it yet. I haven't read about it yet. So maybe if you know this literature, that would be wonderful. But some of the leaders with whom I'm working go to bed tonight with thousands of questions. There's just thousands of things kind of on their minds that subconsciously don't even know that are on their mind, but they're on their mind. And at times I see leaders spending their time and not elevating probably the most important questions for us to dialogue about. They're elevating number 77 on the list and not really the heart of what we need to be discussing, whether it comes to culture or whether it comes to a high functioning team. And also they're elevating the pragmatic stuff, the dashboard conversations also, and not elevating some of the most important. And I think there's an art form to that as well, especially in this place of complexity. Are we elevating the right questions? Because we could have 1,000 different conversations. Yeah, we can. But time is a very scarce resource. And how are we using that? And as a leader, not only are you ambidextrous in when to shift gears and engage in dialogue and co-create with the team, but are you elevating the right questions for that team to work? Do you see that?
Absolutely. So I prefer, at the moment, I'm thinking of leadership as the practice of leadership being around what are we attending to? What do we attend to? And what do we create spaces for in our organizations for others to attend to?
Wow.
And also, by the way, influenced by Vivek's work. I was reading a paper again this morning on the difference between salience and relevance, which came to me when you were talking there. So salience being the things that are immediately grabbing our attention in front of us. And in the workplace, that tends to be, oh my God, what's the quarterly target? And, have we made enough money? And these pressing things. But of course, they may not be what's relevant and what we actually need to look up and look out and figure out together. So part of our job as a leader is to pay attention to what we're paying attention to.
Yes.
And then notice how we are influencing the attention of others.
Yes.
I was at a conference a while back and a really amazing chief executive, and he was speaking to his senior leadership team about how they use their time and was saying pretty much, come on, you need to be paying attention to different things. I look at your diaries and they're full of operational stuff, but we need to be more strategic. We need to develop our teams. And afterwards, I was speaking to him and he was quite sort of exasperated by the fact that his team were paying attention to what they were. And I said to him, well, tell me, when you speak with them each week, what are the first questions that you tend to ask them? Let me take a guess. Yes. Are they about the operations and the quarterly targets?
The KPIs.
And he paused and he went, yeah. And I'm like, so, and we don't notice this as leaders. We don't realize that, of course, our gesture is creating a particular response. Yes. And in that case, it was like, I want them to pay attention to this, but actually, I'm not giving those signals to them. I need to be coming into conversation. And the very first thing I need to say is something like, tell me how you've really developed your team this week. And that way you'll begin to influence. That way, leadership becomes a practice of influencing attention within the organization. And that's what I'm real fascinated by and excited about and haven't written anything on yet.
Well, you made me think of a board that I sat on once. And so similar experience where it's a nonprofit board. and you get to the board meeting, and what do you get sucked into? You get sucked into all of the metrics and where all of that goes. And in that organization, we carved out, it was an hour and a half. These were weekend long meetings. We carved out an hour and a half or 2 hours, and it was a session called Big Questions. And we would choose 2 or 3 big questions, and we would just dialogue. We would have a conversation. But it was always a little bit uncomfortable because no one knew, and we were wandering, and there were a lot of questions. And we knew that these were critical items for us to discuss and kind of get somewhat of a shared sense of. But I think at times, some of these leadership teams, I don't know. It's uncomfortable to wander around in that. Are we even looking at the right question? It's uncomfortable to do that exploration. And so, Heifetz, I think at times calls it work avoidance. We go back to what we know and what's easy. And well, what does the dashboard say? When we need to be carving out that time to do a little bit of wandering, it would seem.
I'm bringing to mind one of my favorite quotes of the last few months in our spaciousness research. And somebody in our inquiry group said, if you open up space, you let in doubt. And who wants that?
Yes.
Which I thought was amazing. And of course, directly relates to dialogue. If you create the space to consider these messier questions, of course, you are letting in doubt. You are loosening control, or the myth of control anyway. And so we are learning, and we're learning more and more the art of distraction. And the instrumental gaze is almost like a vortex. It draws our attention. And the thing that scares me is that then we practice the muscles of the instrumental gaze so much more than that of staying with dialogue, staying with doubt. And I worry that we lose the muscles so much that we almost lose the capacity for dialogue. So that's almost the kind of meta concern I have. Not only is there not enough at the moment, not enough of these spaces, I think, but at this rate, they're being extinguished. And that's the thing that keeps me awake at night.
Well, Megan, we are going to be working together in the coming months, and we'll see how that unfolds in our own dialogue. Maybe we'll do that in public. Maybe we won't. Who knows? But we're going to be working together at the International Studying Leadership Conference in December, and I cannot wait for that. It's going to be so much fun. And I'm just so thankful to have this opportunity to get to know you. Is there anything else that you want listeners to know about before we begin to wind down our time? Is there anything else you want to mention?
I'd only mention, by the way, Scott, I am so excited. Donna Ladkin, shout out to you. Thank you for putting us together. And what I would say is, you see, my curiosity is now all about what's gone through the listener's mind as they've heard this conversation. And I kind of, what do they know that I don't know? I can imagine some of the listeners thinking, I've just read somebody, I know somebody that's working in this area. I would just love to ask whether listeners, if they have been engaged with what we've been talking about and they've got some ideas, or they've got some challenges or some resources. Pretty much the only place that I manage to have a presence on is LinkedIn. But you can find me on that, and you can find me on my website, which is meganreitz.com. I would just so much like to hear from you, because there's that hidden opportunity of what do other people know. So I guess in the spirit of dialogue and opening up a bit, please do, reach out and contact.
Well,
I'd love that.
The spirit within which you enter the conversation, Megan, is also something I very much admire, because at times, similar to what we were just discussing, leaders at times feel the pressure to know and to not open up that space for doubt because, as academics, it's the same gig a lot of the time. It's, oh boy, I don't want anyone to know that I don't have all the answers, that this isn't airtight, that this isn't locked down. And I think you model that curiosity and that vulnerability in a really, really nice way of like, look, we are all exploring. We're all trying to make sense of some of these concepts, these phenomena. And what do you see? And let's together get somewhere, get to another different shared understanding. And you model that beautifully. So I just wanted to say that I appreciate that for sure, because I think we need more of that as well. contingency theory, I think, had 3 meta-analyses supporting it as, the bee's knees back in the 70s. But yeah, I don't know that it's really living.
Thank you for those words, Scott. I think just one thing maybe most people might agree on is that, our leaders, all of us in our leadership practice, wherever we are in various systems, have got our work cut out at the moment.
Yes.
And there aren't any clear solutions, which leaves us in a situation where possibly the most important practice to develop is our capacity to learn and experiment and have conversations about what we are learning together. So therefore, I hope that there are plenty of research projects and opportunities that are aimed at that kind of ongoing experimentation and learning and seeing action happen, because we need it.
Yes. Well said. I always close out by asking what has caught the attention in recent times. And so that could be something we've just discussed. It could have nothing to do with what we've just discussed. But what have you been listening to, reading, streaming? What has caught your eye this summer and that might be of interest to listeners?
So I've just read Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing. And I love it. I absolutely love her work. And I'm hoping that I can get a conversation with her as part of my research. So maybe she's listening, you never know. And I have her next book here, which is Saving Time. And that is coming on holiday with me next week. So Jenny Odell's work is fascinating and very aligned with the research that I'm doing on spaciousness. And I am listening to Tara Brach meditations, and I always listen to my co-author and co-researcher, Michael Chaskelson. He has guided meditations that keep me on a generally sane-ish path most days. So I am guided by them and many other people. That springs to mind, Jenny Odell, and also mindfulness meditations that I listen to most days.
Wonderful. Well, I will put those in the show notes for listeners so you can access those there. Megan, thank you so much for your time today. Can't thank you enough. And I look forward to our future conversations. Thank you for the good work that you do. I am going to be featuring some of your blog posts in my newsletter so that listeners can also access those there. And of course, you'll have access to all of her resources in the show notes. So until next time, thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. I've had a lovely time speaking with you. Thank you.
I have done some work with Toyota, and they have a phrase, Genji Genbutsu, which means go look, go see. And what I love about this conversation with Megan is that she is a scholar, and she's also embedding herself in the context. She's engaging in that action research, that action learning, and participating and learning and going and seeing. And for me, that is the practical wisdom. My bias is that a portion of our scholarship should be highly relevant and highly engaged and in many ways embedded in organizational life. It provides a different perspective. And for me, I just love the work that she does. Megan, we will continue to have conversations. Thank you so much for stopping by. Be well, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.